Albert Stromquist, principal at Lanstrom Advisors, sitting in China. Albert, very curious of what this all looks like from China. So many questions, but let's just start with what seems to be the overnight kind of slight incremental shift in the Chinese position, one of which was fairly reclined and supportive of Russia to overnight indicating the sovereign integrity of the Ukraine to be protected. I don't know if that's a shift, but again, what does this all look like from a Chinese perspective? And can we expect China to be importing a lot of Russian oil?
Well, thank you, Sean, and good to see you again. Look, your question has already given a lot of context to the answer. The respect for sovereignty has always been part of China's toolkit. So that's not new. My take is that the government here in Beijing was hedging, that the invasion was a threat but would not actually go forward. Therefore, the support for the Kremlin was kind of predicated on probably an honest belief that we'd find a diplomatic way through it all before Russian combat troops actually hit the ground in such a devastating way. So therefore, yeah, overnight, there has been the first steps in kind of walking back the support that had been given explicitly a week ago, which is now softening to a plea for diplomacy and disengagement. And that is a substantial change.
Albert, given that, what is at stake here for China? That's the question I struggle to get answers to myself and really articulate. One could see a few things, but what would you look, sitting in China, what do you think is at stake for China in this, and so consequently what posture they take?
Well, I think, simply speaking, an ally, a strong ally. Well, yeah, China's kind of struggling to define itself and to invigorate its Belt and Road Initiative and cultivate its friendships in Africa and South America. And that's going very slowly. And those are all kind of relatively small counterparts to China's ambitions. The big counterpart is Russia. And they do share an ideology, political ideology with Russia of sorts. And they have a very strong and deeply enmeshed partnership in trade, energy trade, industrial investments, education, tourism. All of that is important both to Russia and to China. So I would say an ally, having a strong and stable ally that China can move forward with to confront the rest of the world is probably the key driver in this.
Just again for Albert, is there any point in which this ally can get too toxic to be attached to? It's become too toxic for ExxonMobil. It's become too toxic for many actors. Is there some point where this relationship, where Russia and Putin become potentially too toxic for even China?
Well, they haven't tipped that hand yet, right? So you just be predicting into it from a crystal ball to say that it could become too toxic. That's an imponderable that I really don't have an answer to, Sean.
Your thoughts on that, but also taking it from an Asian perspective, $110 oil burden on your biggest customers, OPEC plus is OPEC's biggest customers, at least, China most notably, but ultimately this is a big dollar number for emerging economies coming out of COVID to absorb. Do they need to be taking that into consideration and the possible erosion of demand erosion?
Sure they do. 110 is a big number. And the EIA decision yesterday to, in conjunction with the US and other importers, to release 60 million barrels, that implies a 2 million barrel per day buffer, right? That's the way it's been positioned, okay? So 2 million a day buys you a month to come up with a better solution. Right? The question in my mind, and is China actually one of the parties to this release, right? And that would play into their policy on mitigating oil price increases at $110 a barrel. And my question, I haven't been able to find an adequate answer to it, is there must be terms and conditions to these releases, right, that transfer crude oil at cost to the refiners. But what are the conditions on the refiners to actually pass through that savings in wholesale prices to the retail outlets? And I don't see that. Otherwise, it sounds like so many nice words until you actually have some confidence that there is a robust policy in place, right, to ensure the delivery of discounts from the release of the petroleum reserves. So if China is kind of part of that strategy, that would be one step they would be taking to mitigate the higher oil price.
Albert, we did see in recent weeks that the Chinese, much to most surprise, were increasing their imports of oil. Perhaps they had foreseen this event happening, but there was a sense in the market that China wouldn't buy at these prices, and that was in the 90s or so on. Now they're obviously above that. How does it look, the US or the Chinese economic outlook? There's been question marks that the impact of the higher cost of all of these commodities, the slowdown in China growth coming this year. What's the outlook at this point coming out of the Beijing Olympics and the sort of New Year period and so forth going ahead?
Well, it's a much more modest view of the future compared to the robust double-digit growth of the past 2 decades. The question of what is going to substitute for this massive investment in construction, in hard assets over the past 2 decades to deliver a sustainable growth trajectory for China. The housing market is pretty saturated now, plus the government has put some pretty tight restrictions on buying housing in China. The airports are mostly all rebuilt, right? The railroads are saturated, railroad terminals. Military has completed a very vast expansion of its hard assets. So, that demand for steel and energy is evaporating very quickly. So what becomes the sustainability strategy for China post this industrial peak?
Considering, and I don't think we've even mentioned it all week, maybe the first time, it's what day is it? Wednesday. COVID. What's COVID? I know in your neck of the woods, however, and looking at, I mean, if Ukraine wasn't on the TV 24/7, maybe the overflowing hospitals in Hong Kong would be on the TV a little bit more often. Hong Kong is getting hit very hard by COVID. Is this a cuckoo in the coal mine for what might come to all of China? And how big an issue is COVID still in China / Hong Kong, which is obviously part of China?
Well, yeah, excellent question. On the Hong Kong side, it's a crisis. Right? It's a crisis for Beijing as well. Beijing was responding with draconian measures to 1 or 2 infections in urban districts, smaller cities. But now in Hong Kong, the infection rate is what I read, say 26,000 new cases per day. Beijing has sent supplies to build a fleet of temporary field hospitals in Hong Kong to bear the overload from the hospitals. Every urgent care bed is taken in Hong Kong. And at the current rate of growth in infections in Hong Kong, they're predicting by July it could be 180,000 cases per day, right? So the challenge to Hong Kong from Beijing is, how are you going to get your minds around this and fix it? And the answer is, where do we start, right? Where do we start to fix this? So what's happening in Hong Kong is that international investors, banks, brokerages, whatever, are beginning now to just pick up stakes and leave. So Hong Kong is just losing its role as a global financial hub and becoming another provincial city in China as a result of all this. And the broader question for China is, with the rest of the world moving to an acknowledgement of an endemic status for COVID, how are they going to justify maintaining closed borders for another year even? But that will happen. There's not going to be any movement on the border closings until after the fall party conference and the confirmation of Xi Jinping as president for life. So it's going to be a tough year here in China.
And a factor on growth, one would think, right? I mean, although growth's already got a damp sort of outlook, this could become quite a significant weight if the policy of zero tolerance is maintained.
Exactly. It's going to have a big impact on growth.